The session was supposed to have ended an hour ago, but the man across from her showed no signs of leaving. In fact, he had made himself comfortable. Dr. Sofia Cruz stood frozen just inside the doorway of her own office, her leather bag clutched in a white-knuckled grip. The room was dimly lit, the late afternoon sun casting long, intrusive shadows across the calming blue walls. He was sitting in her chair, behind her desk. Lorenzo Romano, the man who called himself Mr. Black, casually tilted a framed photograph, examining it under the weak lamplight. It was a picture of her and her late father, taken years ago at her graduation. His voice, when it came, was a low, resonant murmur that seemed to vibrate in the quiet space. "He looks like a good man. Worked himself to the bone for you, didn't he? Always putting everyone else first. You're just like him." Sofia's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "Get out of my chair, Lorenzo." He looked up, and a slow, predatory curve touched his lips. It wasn't a smile, not really. It was a statement of ownership. "This was never your chair to begin with, Sofia. You just kept it warm for me. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you're watching from in the comments 6 months earlier." That chair had been unequivocally hers. It was a well-worn leather throne from which she guided the lost and comforted the wounded. Her office was her sanctuary, a carefully constructed haven of tranquility. The walls were painted a serene shade of twilight blue, and the shelves were crammed with the foundational texts of her profession, from Freud to Jung. Their spines a testament to a decade of rigorous study. A slightly worn but comfortable couch, upholstered in a soft gray fabric, faced her desk, ready to receive the weight of her clients' anxieties. Sofia was good at her job. She possessed a rare combination of sharp intellect and profound empathy that allowed her to see the fractured pieces of a person's psyche and gently guide them toward a semblance of wholeness. She was just finishing a session with a young woman grappling with social anxiety, her voice a soothing balm as she offered a final piece of encouragement. "Remember, progress isn't a straight line, Anna. Be kind to yourself this week." The woman left with a watery, grateful smile, and Sofia felt the familiar hum of professional fulfillment. It was a clean, noble feeling, but as the door clicked shut, it was quickly replaced by the vast, echoing silence of her own life. The quiet in the room was suddenly heavy, a stark reminder of the quiet in her apartment, in her heart. She sank into her chair, the leather sighing under her weight, and pulled out her phone. With a tired expression, she swiped through a dating app. The faces that flickered past were a gallery of men who looked like projects. Men with sad eyes and complicated backstories. Men she knew she would instinctively try to fix. She closed the app with a sigh of self-reproach. Her life was a delicate balancing act of compassion for others and a quiet, gnawing loneliness for herself. Compounding that was the ever-present weight of financial strain. Her student loans were a mountain of debt she chipped away at with a tiny shovel. And the cost of her mother's assisted living facility had just increased again. A constant, low-grade panic simmering just beneath the surface of her calm demeanor. It was in that moment of quiet desperation that her phone rang, displaying a name she hadn't seen in years, Dr. Alistair Finch. He had been her most respected mentor in graduate school, a titan in the field of clinical psychology. "Sofia," he said, his voice a hushed, urgent whisper that immediately set her on edge. There was none of his usual booming warmth. "Forgive the intrusion. I have a referral for you, a high-profile client." He paused, and Sofia could hear the faint sound of him taking a breath. "The fee is extraordinary, triple your usual rate, paid in cash at the beginning of each session. But the discretion required is absolute. No names on records, no digital trail, no questions. He'll use an alias. Are you interested?" The words hung in the air, each one a temptation and a warning. Triple her rate, in cash. It was a lifeline, a tidal wave of relief that could wash away so many of her worries. It could mean a better room for her mother, a significant dent in her loans, a buffer against the constant anxiety. But the conditions were a series of blaring red flags. No names, no records. It went against every ethical guideline she had sworn to uphold. Her professional training screamed at her to refuse, to run in the other direction. But the image of her mother's frail, hopeful face and the stark reality of the bills piled on her kitchen counter screamed louder. Against her better judgment, a voice she barely recognized as her own said, "Yes, I'm interested." A week later, he arrived. Sofia had steeled herself, imagining a rough, thuggish figure, perhaps someone with poorly concealed anger issues and a brutish demeanor. The man who walked into her office was nothing like that. He introduced himself as Mr. Black, but she would later learn his name was Lorenzo Romano. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car, the fabric draping perfectly over a frame that radiated a quiet, coiled power. He wasn't handsome in a conventional way. His features were too sharp, his jaw too severe, but his presence was magnetic. It filled the room, sucking the air from her lungs and replacing it with the subtle, expensive scent of bergamot and sandalwood. He didn't move to the patient's couch. Instead, he stood in the center of the room, his dark eyes sweeping over the space with an unnerving stillness. It wasn't the curious glance of a new patient. It was the cool, methodical assessment of an adversary sizing up the battlefield. He took in the books, the calming blue walls, the frame print of Van Gogh's The Starry Night she had hung opposite the couch. Sofia cleared her throat, forcing a professional calm she did not feel. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Black." He gave a slight nod and finally moved to the couch, sinking into it with a fluid grace that was almost feline. He didn't slouch or fidget. He simply occupied the space, a study in controlled energy. "So, Mr. Black," Sofia began, her pen poised over a blank notepad, a prop she suddenly felt ridiculous holding. "What brings you here today?" A slow smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those remained dark, watchful, impenetrable. "My colleague, Dr. Finch, spoke very highly of you. He said you were the best at helping people understand their motivations." He leaned forward slightly, the subtle shift in posture instantly making the space between them feel smaller, more intimate. "So, tell me, Dr. Cruz, what motivates you?" The question was a perfectly executed parry. It caught her completely off guard. She was the one who asked the questions, who directed the flow of the session. She blinked, a small, involuntary sign of her surprise. "This time is for you, Mr. Black. We're here to talk about what's on your mind." "Humor me," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "You've dedicated your life to untangling the knots inside other people's heads. That requires a certain kind of person, a person who runs toward the fire." Why? The session continued like that, a masterclass in deflection and control, all of it orchestrated by him. He expertly turned every one of her therapeutic inquiries back on her. He asked about her practice, why she chose this specific neighborhood, what the worn copy of Man and His Symbols on her shelf meant to her. He offered nothing of substance about himself, only vague allusions to stressful negotiations and the burdens of managing a large complex family business. He painted a picture of a high-powered CEO navigating a corporate shark tank, but the metaphors felt thin, like a silk sheet draped over something large and dangerous. When the hour was up, Sofia felt completely wrong-footed, as if she had just gone 10 rounds in a boxing ring she hadn't even known she was in. She was frustrated. Her professional pride stung by her inability to penetrate his defenses. But beneath the frustration, a different feeling was taking root, something she was reluctant to name: intrigue. He was a puzzle, a locked room, a challenge unlike any she had ever faced. She walked him to the door, her mind racing. As he stepped out, she rationalized his behavior. This wasn't a game to him, she told herself. It was a defense mechanism. His resistance, his need to control the situation, was just a symptom of a deep-seated trauma. He was a man encased in armor, and it was her job to find the chinks, to help him finally set the shield down. It was a dangerous thought, but a compelling one. She was, after all, a healer, and he was the most fascinatingly broken man she had ever met. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, hypnotic rhythm. The sessions with Mr. Black became the central magnetic point around which Sofia's entire life revolved. He was always punctual, always impeccably dressed, and he always paid in crisp, unmarked $100 bills that he would place in a neat stack on the edge of her desk before settling onto the couch. He appeared, for all intents and purposes, to be a model patient, willing to talk, to explore the labyrinth of his mind. But the stories he told were not his own, not really. They were allegories, carefully constructed corporate fables delivered in his low, captivating voice. He spoke of a recent hostile takeover, describing with chilling detachment the strategic dismantling of a rival company. Sofia, trained to listen for the emotional subtext, heard the echoes of a brutal gang war, the clinical language of business masking the grim reality of violence and dominance. He lamented the difficult necessity of downsizing, framing the elimination of threats as a painful but essential business decision to ensure the health of the parent company. He spoke of the burden of loyalty to his family, painting a portrait of a man shackled by duty to a vast, demanding, and often ruthless corporate empire. He never broke character, never slipped. His narrative was a fortress, and Sofia found herself standing outside its walls, listening to the muffled sounds of battle within, unable to find a way inside. Yet she leaned in. With each session, she found herself more captivated, drawn deeper into the intricate web of his storytelling. Her professional objectivity, once a solid and reliable shield, began to feel porous. She was fascinated by the raw, predatory intelligence that burned behind his dark eyes, the sheer force of will that allowed him to construct and maintain such a flawless facade. He was a storm contained in a suit, a vortex of power and control, and she felt the dangerous pull of it. A strange, unsettling connection began to form in the space between them, a sense of being truly seen by him in a way that no one, not her clients, not her friends, not the parade of disappointing men from her dating apps, had ever managed. He listened to her questions with an intensity that felt less like a patient receiving guidance and more like a predator studying its prey. He seemed to absorb her, to catalog her every inflection, every subtle shift in posture. The professional boundaries she had spent her career fortifying began to feel like a line drawn in the sand, with the tide of his charisma relentlessly washing it away. She told herself it was professional curiosity, the ultimate psychological challenge, but a more honest, more terrifying voice deep within her whispered that it was something more. The shift happened during their fourth session. It was a gray, drizzly afternoon, and the soft drumming of rain against the window pane was the only sound in the room. Lorenzo had been in the middle of a particularly complex allegory involving a breach of contract and a disloyal board member when his gaze drifted away from her and settled on the photograph on her desk, the one of him and her father. He fell silent, his story abandoned mid-sentence. Sofia waited, her pen hovering over her notepad. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, stripped of its usual corporate armor. "You have his eyes," he said, his gaze still fixed on the silver frame. "But your smile is sadder. Does the weight of his legacy ever feel heavy?" The question was not from Mr. Black, the CEO. It was from Lorenzo, the man. It was deeply personal, a surgical strike that bypassed all her professional defenses and hit something raw and vulnerable within her. She felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. Before she could formulate a response, a deflection of her own, he continued, his focus shifting from the photograph to her. He began to probe her past, not with the gentle, exploratory questions of a therapist, but with direct, unnervingly insightful observations. He asked about her childhood, not the events, but the feelings, the unspoken tensions. He asked about her relationship with her mother, somehow intuiting the dynamic of duty and guilt that defined it. He gestured vaguely around the office, at the walls of books and the solitary, artful decor. "A woman like you," he mused, his voice a low murmur. "You must have men falling at your feet. Yet I see no evidence of a partner, no smiling photos on the shelves, no trinkets from shared vacations, only books and work and the ghost of your father." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers, and delivered the final, devastating blow. "You prefer fixing broken things to having something whole, don't you?" The words landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical impact. It was true, brutally, undeniably true, and hearing it from him, from the man who was supposed to be her patient, felt like a profound violation, a complete inversion of their roles. She was the one who was supposed to see, to understand. But in that moment, she felt utterly, terrifyingly transparent. As the session concluded, a palpable tension lingered in the air. Sofia walked him to the door, her mind still reeling from his observation. She felt exposed, as if he had peeled back a layer of her skin and examined the intricate workings beneath. As she opened the door to the hallway, her eyes were drawn to the street outside. A sleek black sedan, the kind that speaks of quiet, immense wealth, was idling at the curb. Its windows were tinted to an opaque, menacing darkness. As Lorenzo stepped out of the building, a large, powerfully built man with a network of faint scars across his cheekbone immediately exited the driver's side. He moved with a paranoid, restless energy, his eyes constantly scanning the street, the rooftops, the windows of the neighboring buildings. He opened the rear door for Lorenzo, his posture deferential, but his presence radiating a lethal competence. As Lorenzo ducked into the car, the man spoke, his voice a low, guttural rumble that was absorbed by the city air. Tutto a posto, capo. Is everything all right, boss? The Italian words, though spoken quietly, seemed to hang in the air, sharp and definitive. The bodyguard's demeanor was not that of a corporate driver. It was the cold, professional alertness of a soldier. The quiet, authoritative hum of the expensive engine, the final, solid thud of the door closing, it all coalesced into a single, chilling realization. A shiver, cold and sharp, traced a path down Sofia's spine. The corporate metaphors, the allegories of hostile takeovers and boardroom betrayals, were not just metaphors. They were a flimsy silk veil draped over a world of real, tangible danger. The man she was treating, the man who had just dissected her soul with unnerving precision, was not just a CEO. He was a capo. The danger, which had until now been an abstract concept, a thrilling intellectual puzzle, suddenly felt terrifyingly real. The stark contrast between Lorenzo's world and her own was thrown into sharp relief 2 nights later. Sofia was on a date with Mark, a struggling musician she had been seeing for a few weeks. He was the quintessential project Lorenzo had described, a man of fleeting talent and boundless grievances. They sat in a dimly lit Italian restaurant, the kind with checkered tablecloths and candles dripping wax down the sides of Chianti bottles. Mark spent the entire dinner complaining. He complained about his bandmates, who he claimed were holding him back with their lack of vision. He complained about the club owners who didn't appreciate his artistic integrity. He complained about his ex-girlfriend, who had been, in his telling, a soul-crushing succubus. He spoke in a long, whining monologue, expecting Sofia to nod, to soothe, to validate, to offer solutions. He wanted a therapist, not a partner. Sofia found herself pushing a piece of overcooked ravioli around her plate, a profound sense of boredom and irritation settling over her like a shroud. Mark's problems, which he presented as epic tragedies, seemed so trivial, so self-inflicted, so utterly inconsequential compared to the complex, high-stakes world Lorenzo hinted at. She thought of Lorenzo's veiled stories of life and death decisions, of loyalty and betrayal that carried ultimate consequences. She thought of the cold, watchful eyes of his bodyguard and the quiet power of the black sedan. She looked at Mark, with his carefully distressed T-shirt and his air of wounded genius, and felt a wave of revulsion. Lorenzo was right. She was a collector of broken things, and she was tired of the dust. She went to her next session feeling weary and disillusioned. She hadn't mentioned the date, hadn't mentioned Mark at all. She had planned to steer the conversation back to Lorenzo, to try and regain some semblance of professional control. But as she sat down behind her desk, Lorenzo, who was already seated on the couch, looked at her with his unnervingly perceptive gaze. He took in the faint dark circles under her eyes, the slight slump of her shoulders, the forced professionalism in her smile. He was silent for a long moment, simply watching her. Then he spoke, his voice devoid of judgment, a simple statement of fact. "You look tired, Sofia," he said softly. "Were you up late trying to glue another broken man back together?" The accuracy of the statement was stunning. It was as if he had been a fly on the wall at the restaurant, a silent observer of her pathetic, frustrating evening. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, washed over her. He saw everything. There were no walls she could build, no professional mask she could wear that was opaque enough to hide her from his sight. The feeling was no longer intriguing. It was terrifying. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been completely and irrevocably shattered. She was no longer the doctor. She was the patient, and the man on her couch was the one holding the scalpel. The fear did not dissipate. It followed Sofia home from the office, a cold, silent passenger in her car. It settled in the corners of her small apartment, making the familiar space feel alien and unsafe. The session had left her feeling hollowed out, her professional confidence shattered into a million pieces. The image of the black sedan, the scarred bodyguard, and the casual, chilling authority in the word capo played on a loop in her mind. The intellectual puzzle had become a visceral threat, and the fear was now morphing into something else, something sharper and more urgent, a desperate, obsessive need for answers. Late that night, long after the city had quieted to a distant hum, Sofia sat in the glow of her laptop screen. Her apartment, usually a cozy refuge of soft throws and stacks of novels, felt like a cage. Every creak of the old building, every siren in the distance, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She started where any search began, typing the ridiculous, generic alias into the search bar. Mr. Black. The results were a meaningless flood of businesses, book characters, and random social media profiles. It was a digital dead end, as he had intended. The complete absence of any plausible lead was, in itself, a confirmation. This wasn't a man who was merely private. This was a man who was professionally invisible. She leaned back, closing her eyes and forcing her racing mind to be still. She replayed their sessions, not as a therapist looking for clinical clues, but as a detective searching for a slip, a crack in the facade. He was so controlled, so disciplined, but in one of his corporate allegories, a story about absorbing a smaller, failing entity, he had mentioned a name. It was a fleeting detail, a piece of narrative texture she had barely registered at the time. He'd called it a holding company, a subsidiary used for asset management. LR Imports. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her heart thudding with a mixture of dread and grim purpose. The search for LR Imports was not a dead end. It was a fortress. The first result was a bare-bones website, with a corporate logo and a post office box address in Delaware. From there, the trail fractured into a dozen different paths, each one leading deeper into a labyrinth of legal obfuscation. She found herself clicking through a dizzying network of shell corporations registered in Panama, the Cayman Islands, and Cyprus. The directors were anonymous, represented by law firms that specialized in creating untraceable corporate structures. It was a digital fortress, a multi-layered and fantastically expensive system designed for one purpose: to make the person at the center a ghost. The more she searched, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about tax avoidance or hiding assets. This was about erasing an identity on an industrial scale. The sheer complexity of it all spoke of immense resources and a profound need for secrecy that went far beyond the concerns of a legitimate, if ruthless, businessman. The man on her couch wasn't just hiding something, he was hiding everything. The fear that had been a cold knot in her stomach began to burn. It was no longer just a feeling, it was a fuel. She had to know who he was. She had to see the face behind the mask, no matter how monstrous it might be. 2 days later, the answer arrived. Not through her frantic, late-night digging, but through the mundane channels of a city courier. A man in a crisp uniform appeared at her office door in the middle of the afternoon, holding a simple, medium-sized cardboard box and a digital scanner for her signature. The transaction was brief and impersonal, yet as Sofia took the package, she felt its weight, a significance that went far beyond its physical mass. There was no return address. Back at her desk, she stared at the plain brown box. For a long moment, she didn't move. It felt like a test. Another one of his calculated moves designed to provoke a reaction he could then analyze. With a deep, steadying breath, she sliced through the packing tape with a letter opener. Inside, nestled in a bed of protective foam, was a book. But it wasn't just any book. It was a large leather-bound volume, its cover a deep oxblood red. She lifted it from the box, her hands trembling slightly. The leather was old, supple, and cool to the touch. The title was embossed in simple gold leaf on the spine, Carl Jung's The Red Book. It was a first edition. The air left her lungs in a silent rush. She sank into her chair, the heavy book resting in her lap. The smell of old paper and rich cured leather filled her senses, a scent of history and profound thought. Years ago, during a graduate seminar, she had passionately argued that this book, Jung's private, illustrated journey into his own subconscious, was the true foundation of his later work. She had called it the most honest and courageous text in modern psychology. She had mentioned this once, in passing, during an early session with Lorenzo, using it as an example of how even the masters of the mind had to confront their own inner chaos. He had listened, his expression unreadable, and she had assumed the comment was forgotten, just another drop in the ocean of their conversations. He hadn't forgotten. He had listened, catalogued, and filed away that piece of her history, her passion. This gift wasn't a generic offering of flowers or a thoughtless bottle of wine. It was a targeted strike to the very core of her intellectual identity. It was an incredibly intimate, thoughtful, and deeply generous gesture. And it was the most profound violation she had ever experienced. A confusing, chaotic storm of emotions swirled within her. She felt a wave of flattery, a dizzying sense of being seen and understood on a level that no one ever had before. She felt a surge of gratitude. This was a collector's item, a piece of history she could never have dreamed of owning. And beneath it all, she felt a deep, chilling dread. He wasn't just a patient. He was a student of horror. He was mapping her psyche, learning her pressure points, her desires, her weaknesses. This book wasn't a gift. It was a trophy from his reconnaissance, a demonstration of his power, his reach, and his terrifying, all-encompassing attention. The book was on her desk for their next session, placed squarely in the center, a silent accusation between them. The air in the room was thick with it. Lorenzo walked in, his eyes immediately landing on the red leather volume. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging an opening chess move, and then settled onto the couch, the picture of calm. Sofia let the silence stretch, refusing to be the first to speak. She would not let him control the narrative this time. Finally, when the quiet became a tangible presence, she spoke, her voice clear and cold, stripped of all therapeutic warmth. This is inappropriate. He didn't feign ignorance. He simply watched her, his dark eyes holding a flicker of what looked like academic curiosity. Our relationship is purely professional, she continued, her voice gaining strength. It is bound by a strict ethical code. A gift of this nature is a fundamental breach of that code. I can't accept this. She had rehearsed the words, tried to imbue them with the full authority of her professional standing. Lorenzo didn't apologize. He didn't look chastised or embarrassed. He leaned forward, the familiar, intense motion that always seemed to shrink the space between them. His expression was serious, his gaze unwavering. "Why does a gift make you so uncomfortable, doctor?" he asked, his voice a low, reasonable murmur. "A gift from a grateful client. Is it the object itself or the gesture?" "It's the boundary it crosses," she said, her jaw tight. "The boundary that is essential for a therapeutic relationship to function." "Is it?" he countered, tilting his head slightly. "Or is it because you didn't earn it? Because it wasn't a reward for your labor?" He let the question hang in the air for a moment before pressing his advantage. "Tell me, Sofia, does it make you uncomfortable because someone gave you something beautiful without you having to fix them first?" The question was a scalpel, expertly wielded. It sliced through her professional objections and laid bare the very psychological mechanism he had identified in her weeks ago. Her savior complex, her need to earn affection through service, through healing. He was framing her ethics not as a professional standard, but as a personal pathology. She felt a hot flush of anger and humiliation. Before she could gather her thoughts to respond, he leaned back, a subtle, calculated retreat. The intensity in his eyes softened, replaced by a look of calm resolution. He had made his point. He had won the exchange, and now he was ready to end the game. "My name is Lorenzo Romano," he said, the words spoken with a simple, unadorned finality. "I thought it was time we dispensed with the formalities." The name hung in the air, heavy and absolute. It wasn't a confession, it was a coronation. He hadn't been a patient playing games. He had been a king, patiently waiting for her to realize she was in the presence of royalty. The session ended shortly after. Sofia couldn't remember what was said. Her mind was a roaring void, filled with only that name, Lorenzo Romano. She fled the office as if it were on fire, the heavy red book left sitting on her desk like an unexploded bomb. Back in the fragile safety of her apartment, she moved with the jerky, unnatural motions of a marionette. She sat at her computer, the glow of the screen casting a pale, sickly light on her face. Her hands trembled as she typed the name into the search bar, each keystroke a hammer blow against the fragile wall of her denial. The results were not a rabbit hole. They were an avalanche. The screen flooded with a torrent of information, a deluge of darkness that drowned her in an instant. There were no more shell corporations, no more digital ghosts. The name Lorenzo Romano was horribly, terrifyingly real. News articles from every major publication in the city screamed from the screen, their headlines a litany of crime and violence. Romano family linked to dock workers' union extortion. FBI task force targets Romano crime syndicate. Rival gang boss found dead in suspected Romano hit. She clicked on a link from a well-known investigative journalism blog. It detailed the history of the Romano family, a decades-long reign over the city's underworld, built on racketeering, loan, sharking, and murder. And at the top of the pyramid, the undisputed boss, the man who had inherited the throne after the bloody and mysterious disappearance of his uncle, was Lorenzo Romano. The articles were accompanied by photographs. She saw him, his face an unreadable mask of stone, standing behind a limousine at the funeral of a rival, his presence a clear and chilling statement. She saw him walking out of a federal courthouse, surrounded by a phalanx of expensive lawyers, his eyes cold and defiant, as he ignored the shouted questions from reporters. There was a grainy black and white surveillance photo of him sitting in a social club, sharing a drink with men whose faces were a gallery of brutality. He was younger in the photo, but the coiled stillness, the predatory calm, was already there. The floor dropped out from beneath her. The charming, intelligent, wounded man from her couch was a phantom, a carefully crafted illusion she had desperately wanted to believe in. The real man was here, on her screen, his legacy written in blood and fear. Every session, every shared vulnerability, every allegorical tale of corporate warfare was cast in a new, grotesquely sinister light. He hadn't been deflecting. He had been toying with her, using the language of her profession to mock her, to test her, to see how far he could push her. A wave of nausea washed over her. She felt naive, stupid, a fool who had mistaken the purr of a tiger for the plea of a lost kitten. She had walked willingly into the cage, drawn by the intellectual challenge, by the allure of the ultimate reclamation project. And he had let her, watching with detached amusement as she analyzed the beautiful patterns on his coat, all the while sharpening his claws. She was trapped. The knowledge she now possessed was a poison, and the man who had given it to her was not someone you could simply terminate a session with. He was not a patient. He was a predator, and she had just realized she was locked in the room with him. The following session was an exercise in controlled terror. Sofia spent 2 days rehearsing her speech, the words feeling like foreign objects in her mouth. She practiced in front of her bathroom mirror, her own reflection looking back at her, pale and wide-eyed, a stranger in her own skin. The fear that had initially paralyzed her had now cooled into a brittle, desperate resolve. She could not continue. To do so would not only be a catastrophic breach of ethics, it would be an act of profound self-destruction. She was a psychologist, not a confessor for the damned. She was in her office an hour early, the space that had once been her sanctuary, now feeling like the scene of a crime. The calming blue walls seemed to mock her. The comfortable gray couch looked like an altar where she had sacrificed her own judgment. She sat behind her desk, not in her usual relaxed posture, but perched on the edge of her chair, her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap. She had placed the heavy red leather copy of Jung's work back in its box and hidden it in her closet at home, unable to look at it, unable to throw it away. When Lorenzo arrived, he was, as always, punctual to the second. He walked in with his usual fluid confidence, but he stopped just inside the door, his dark eyes immediately registering the tension in the room. He saw her pallor, the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle jumped along her cheek. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a change in the weather, and moved to the couch, settling into it without a word. Sofia took a deep, shaky breath, the rehearsed words suddenly feeling flimsy and inadequate. "Lorenzo," she began, her voice thin but steady, "I've discovered the truth about who you are." He did not react. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, his stillness a stark, unnerving contrast to the frantic hammering of her own heart. "I cannot, in good conscience, continue as your therapist," she forced the words out, each one a heavy stone she had to lift. "Our professional relationship is terminated. It has to be. I will, if you wish, provide a referral to another practitioner, though I will not disclose any of the specifics of our sessions." He remained perfectly calm, his hands resting lightly on his knees. He didn't move, didn't threaten, didn't even blink. He just watched her, letting her words hang in the suffocating silence of the room. The lack of a response was more unnerving than any outburst would have been. He was giving her nothing, forcing her to confront the full weight of her own declaration. Finally, after a silence that stretched for an eternity, he spoke, his voice a low, reasonable murmur. "And what is the truth, Sofia? That my business is messier than most? That my solutions to personnel problems are more permanent than a pink slip?" He tilted his head, a gesture of mild curiosity. "I never lied to you. I told you I had a family to protect, a complex business to manage. You were the one who filled in the blanks, doctor. You painted the picture you wanted to see, a troubled CEO, a wounded titan of industry. You saw a project." He paused, letting the accusation land. "Is your conscience truly offended, or is your fear simply greater than your curiosity?" The question was a direct hit, a challenge to the very core of her professional identity. He was right. Her fear was a roaring beast in her chest, but her curiosity, the insatiable need to understand the complexities of the human mind that had driven her to this profession, was still there, a stubborn, flickering flame in the storm. She was about to insist, to tell him to leave, to threaten to call the police, a threat she knew was laughably empty, when he changed tactics. The shift was subtle but absolute. He broke eye contact, his gaze dropping to the floor. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since she had met him, Sofia saw a genuine, undeniable crack in his armor of control. The mask of the capo, of the master manipulator, slipped, and in its place was something raw and unguarded. "When I was 10 years old," he began, his voice suddenly rough, stripped of its smooth, velvety texture. It was the voice of a man speaking from a deep, unhealed wound. "I watched my father die. He was shot in front of me, in our own home." He looked up, and his eyes, for a fleeting second, were not the eyes of a predator, but of a lost and terrified child. The men who did it, they weren't rivals, they weren't enemies. They worked for his most trusted friend, his consigliere, a man I called uncle. I watched my father bleed out on a Persian rug, while his best friend explained that it was just business. The story was brutal, delivered with a raw, unvarnished pain that cut through Sofia's fear like a hot knife. It silenced the frantic screaming in her mind. This was it, the core trauma, the foundational wound from which all the darkness grew. It was the kind of primal scene that psychologists spent their entire careers trying to unearth, the secret key that unlocked the entire pathological structure of a personality. He looked away again, his profile sharp and severe against the soft gray light from the window. "I learned that day that loyalty is a commodity, something to be bought and sold. And love," he said the word with a quiet, chilling bitterness, "love is a liability. That is what I wanted to talk about. That is the knot I can't untangle. That is why I came here." He finally turned his gaze back to her, the vulnerability receding, replaced by a look of weary resignation. "But I see now that was a mistake. You see the monster, and you can't see anything else." Sofia's mind was a war zone. Her fear, her instinct for self-preservation, screamed at her to run, to get him out of her office, out of her life, to burn the couch he sat on. He was a murderer, a crime boss. He was manipulating her, she knew he was. This confession, this perfectly timed moment of vulnerability, was just another tool, another move in his game. He had deployed it with surgical precision at the exact moment she was about to sever their connection. And yet, the pain in his voice had felt real. The image he painted of a 10-year-old boy watching his father die was too stark, too horrifying to be pure invention. The trauma felt authentic, a deep, festering wound that he had carried for decades. Her professional instincts, honed by years of training and practice, were screaming just as loudly as her fear. They were screaming that this was the work. This was the entire point of her existence as a healer. To turn away now, to abandon him with this wound freshly reopened, felt like a dereliction of the most fundamental duty she had. Could she truly turn her back on someone so clearly, so profoundly damaged? Was this not the ultimate test of her skills, of her compassion? She saw the wounded boy beneath the monster, the child frozen in a moment of unimaginable horror. And the therapist in her responded, overriding the terrified woman. She told herself it was a clinical decision. She could not just throw him out. That would be irresponsible, potentially dangerous. He was in a fragile state. She needed to provide a proper clinical closure, a safe and structured termination of their sessions. She needed to ensure he was referred to someone capable of handling this, to make sure this raw wound wasn't left to fester and erupt in more violence. She would hold one final session, just one, to do it right, to do her job. No, she said, her voice surprisingly calm. It wasn't a mistake. She looked at him, meeting his gaze, the power dynamic in the room shifting once again, settling into a precarious, dangerous equilibrium. We can talk about it. One more session to discuss this. And then we can formulate a plan for your future treatment. A flicker of something, triumph perhaps, or maybe just relief, passed through his eyes before it was extinguished, replaced once again by his careful, unreadable mask. He gave a single slow nod. One more session. The fragile truce she had brokered with her own conscience, the dangerous bargain she had made, was shattered less than 48 hours later. The call came late in the evening, just as she was trying to lose herself in a mindless television show, a futile attempt to silence the roaring in her head. It was Mark. His voice was a high, frantic whine, laced with a terror that was almost theatrical. "Sophia, oh God, Sophia, you have to help me," he cried, his words tumbling over each other in a panicked rush. Sophia sat up, her heart sinking. "Mark, what is it? What's wrong?" "It's the money, the investment. It wasn't a sure thing, Soph. It was a bust," he wailed. "I lost it all, and I owe them. I owe them everything." "Owe who, Mark? What are you talking about?" she asked, a cold dread beginning to creep up her spine. "A loan," he sobbed. "I took out a loan to cover the investment. Just a short-term thing. But the guy, he's not a banker, Sophia. He's not a nice person." He took a ragged breath. "He wants his money back, with the interest. He says I have until Friday. He says if I don't have it, he's going to break my hands, Sophia." "My hands? I'm a musician. What am I supposed to do without my hands?" The number, when he finally choked it out, felt like a physical blow. $100,000, an impossible, astronomical sum. "Mark, I don't have that kind of money," she said, her voice flat with a mixture of fury and exhaustion. "Nobody I know has that kind of money. You need to go to the police." "The police," he scoffed, a hysterical laugh bubbling up. "You think the police can help? These people, they don't care about the police. You're the only one who can help me, Soph. You're smart, you can figure something out. Please, I'm begging you." He continued to plead, his voice growing more desperate, more pathetic. But Sophia was barely listening. She was overwhelmed, furious at his stupidity, at his weakness, at the way he was trying to make his catastrophic failure her problem to solve. He was another broken man, another project. But this one was not just emotionally draining. He was dragging her into a world of real, physical danger. She ended the call, her hands shaking with anger. She felt trapped, suffocated by the converging pressures of her life. On one side was Lorenzo, a man of immense power and darkness, who was systematically dismantling her life from the inside out. On the other was Mark, a man of immense weakness, whose foolishness had now entangled her in the very criminal underworld Lorenzo inhabited. She didn't know it, of course. She couldn't possibly know that the loan shark Mark had been foolish enough to borrow from was a man named Silvio Moretti, a captain in the Falcone crime family. The Falcones were the Romano family's chief rivals, a thorn in Lorenzo's side that he had been looking for a reason to remove. Lorenzo's network was a vast and intricate web of eyes and ears, spread throughout the city's underbelly, and word of a struggling musician, a musician who was known to be dating Dr. Sofia Cruz, getting himself into a $100,000 hole with a Falcone captain, traveled through that web with the speed of electricity. The news reached Lorenzo's desk less than an hour after Mark made his frantic, tearful call. And Lorenzo Romano was not a man who believed in coincidences. He was a man who believed in opportunities. 2 days later, Mark called Sofia again. The frantic, weeping desperation in his voice was gone, replaced by an almost manic ecstasy that was somehow even more grating. "You won't believe it, Sof. It's a miracle," he shouted into the phone, his voice cracking with joy. "The debt, it's just gone, poof. The guy, Silvio, he called me himself. He was terrified, babbling about a misunderstanding and how I should forget his name and never contact him again. He sounded like he'd seen a ghost." "It's a miracle." Sofia stood in her kitchen, the phone pressed to her ear, a mug of cold coffee forgotten in her other hand. A cold dread, thick and suffocating, washed over her, extinguishing the last embers of her anger at him. It wasn't a miracle, it was a transaction, and she knew, with a certainty that felt like ice in her veins, who had paid the price. The next session with Lorenzo felt like a walk to the gallows. The air in the office was heavy and still, charged with unspoken knowledge. Sofia sat stiffly behind her desk, a useless prop, while Lorenzo lounged on the couch, the picture of relaxed confidence. He spoke for most of the hour, spinning another one of his corporate fables, this time about a minor competitor who had overstepped their bounds and needed to be reminded of their place in the market. He spoke of leveraged assets and permanent dissolution of a problematic subsidiary. The words were sterile, but Sofia heard the grim reality beneath them. She heard the terror in Mark's loan shark's voice. She heard the breaking of hands, or worse. He waited until the final minutes of the hour, a master of timing. He let the silence settle after his story, then looked at her, his dark eyes holding a calm, proprietary gaze. "I hear your friend, the musician, had some financial trouble," he said, his voice as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "It's been taken care of." The confirmation, delivered so placidly, stole the air from her lungs. She stared at him, her professional mask crumbling to dust. "What did you do?" she whispered, the words barely audible. He smiled, a slight chilling curve of his lips. "I fixed it," he said simply. "The way I fix things, permanently." He leaned forward, the warmth and empathy he had feigned in previous sessions gone, replaced by a cold, clinical precision. "This is the kind of broken man you waste your compassion on, Sofia. A man whose weakness is a contagion, who drags you down into his own pathetic messes. He was a problem, a loose end that connected my world to yours in a way I found untidy." He settled back into the couch, a king on his throne. I removed the problem. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it irrevocably inverted. It shattered. Sofia was no longer the doctor, the guide, the one in control. She was the specimen, pinned to a board, every nerve exposed and trembling under his unblinking gaze. She felt utterly powerless. Her entire life, her finances, her family, her deepest psychological patterns, laid bare before him. He knew everything. He stood up, the movement fluid and deliberate, and walked over to her window, his tall frame silhouetted against the gray city skyline. He looked down at the street for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back. When he spoke again, his voice was a low, hypnotic murmur, the voice of a man delivering a final, irrefutable diagnosis. "Your whole life you've been drawn to them," he said, his gaze still fixed on the world below. "Men you can pity, men who make you feel strong because they are so weak. Your father, a good man who worked himself into an early grave for everyone but himself. Your parade of boyfriends, the struggling artists, the wounded poets, the men with bottomless needs and empty pockets." He turned from the window, his eyes finding hers across the room. They were dark, intense, and held a terrifying clarity. "You try to heal them to heal the part of yourself that broke when you were a child, watching your own father sacrifice his happiness piece by piece. You think you're the healer, Sofia, but you're just collecting broken mirrors to avoid looking at your own reflection." He took a step closer, then another. He stopped directly in front of her desk, the large oak barrier suddenly feeling like a flimsy piece of cardboard. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the polished wood, his presence overwhelming. His eyes locked onto hers, and she felt as if she were drowning in their depths. "You've been fixing broken men your whole life, Sophia," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, intimate and absolute. "But now, it's my turn to fix you." The sessions transformed. The pretense was gone. The couch, once the centerpiece of the therapeutic process, went unused. Lorenzo would pace the office like a caged panther or sit in her chair, forcing her to take the seat of the patient. He no longer spoke in allegories. He spoke about her. He led every session, his questions like a surgeon's probes, precise, relentless, and aimed at the most vulnerable parts of her psyche. He deconstructed her life with a chilling, brutal accuracy that left her speechless. "Why do you live in this small apartment in a neighborhood you've outgrown?" he asked one afternoon, gesturing at the window. "You could afford a penthouse with the money you've saved, yet you choose to live like a graduate student. Is it a penance? Do you feel you don't deserve comfort?" Another day, he brought up her family. "You send more than half your income to your mother's care facility, a place that costs a fortune, while your brother, who makes twice what you do, contributes nothing. You call it your duty. I call it enabling his selfishness. You allow him to be weak, and you pay the price. Why? Why do you protect him from responsibility at the cost of your own future?" He challenged every choice, every sacrifice, every carefully constructed justification she had built her life upon. He held up a mirror not to her actions, but to her motivations, and the reflection was unflattering, pathetic, and undeniably true. "You wear sacrifice like a shield, Sophia," he told her, his voice devoid of malice, stating it as a simple fact. "You believe it makes you noble, selfless, but it's not nobility, it's fear. It's a cage you built for yourself, bar by bar, with every check you've written for someone else, with every need of your own that you've denied. It's safe in the cage. You never have to risk wanting something for yourself. You never have to risk failing to get it." He paused, his eyes burning into her. "I'm going to teach you how to want things, how to take them." The culmination of his new, twisted therapy came a week later. He arrived and placed a single sealed manila envelope on her desk. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. Sophia stared at it, her heart beginning to pound a familiar, frantic rhythm. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tight. "An investment," he replied calmly. "Open it." Her hands trembled as she picked up the envelope and tore open the flap. Inside was not a letter, but a single, crisp document. It was a bank statement. At the top, printed in bold, official type, was her name, Dr. Sofia Cruz. And below it, next to the words, "account balance," was a number that made her vision swim. $1 million. She dropped the paper as if it were on fire. It fluttered to the floor, landing face up. The number seemed to glow in the dim light of the office. "What have you done?" she breathed, looking at him in horror. "I've given you freedom," he said, his voice even. "This is not a gift, Sophia. A gift implies a debt, and you have enough of those. This is an investment. In you." He began to tick off the points on his fingers, a CEO outlining a business plan. "Your student loans are paid in full as of this morning. I took the liberty. Your mother's care facility has been paid in advance for the next decade. You no longer have any excuses. The cage is open. Your life is your own, unburdened by the needs of others." He leaned back, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. "So the question is, what will you do with it?" Sophia was in turmoil. The world had tilted on its axis, and she was sliding off. She refused to touch the money. She refused to even acknowledge the account's existence. She spent the next session arguing with him, trying to reassert her professional authority, her ethical boundaries, her sense of right and wrong. But her arguments felt like paper shields against a battering ram. His analysis of her self-inflicted martyrdom, was brutally, undeniably correct. He had seen the cage she had built for herself, and with a casual, terrifying display of power, he had simply bought the key and unlocked the door. She was caught in an impossible, terrifying trap. She was repulsed by his methods, by the source of this blood money that now sat in an account bearing her name. The thought of using it made her physically ill. He was a monster, a killer, and this was the fruit of his violence. Yet, a part of her, a part she was horrified to acknowledge, was undeniably drawn to the terrifying, exhilarating freedom he represented. He was the only person in her entire life who had ever challenged her to be selfish, to be powerful, to take what she wanted instead of waiting for what was left over. The fear was still there, a constant, cold companion. But now it was mixed with a new, intoxicating emotion, a terrifying sense of possibility. The bars of her cage had vanished, and she was standing in the open, blinking in a light so bright it was blinding. And the man who had freed her was the devil himself. The sessions that followed were a strange, silent war. Sofia had not touched the money. The bank statement lay hidden in a drawer, a toxic promise she refused to acknowledge. Yet its existence had changed the very air she breathed. The low-grade panic about bills, the constant gnawing anxiety about her mother's care, the weight of her student loans, all of it had vanished. For the first time in her adult life, the crushing pressure of financial necessity was gone, and in its absence, a new kind of strength began to coalesce. She was no longer desperate, and a woman who is not desperate is a woman who cannot be easily controlled. She had become stronger, more defiant. She met Lorenzo's gaze without flinching. She listened to his chillingly accurate deconstructions of her psyche, not with the stunned horror of a victim, but with the cool appraisal of a peer. She was learning his method, studying his technique. The last session of his twisted intervention had arrived, and Sofia knew it was time to seize control of the narrative. He was sitting in her chair again, a casual act of dominance that no longer intimidated her. She stood by the window, looking down at the city, her city. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and clear, holding a new resonance of command. "Why me, Lorenzo?" He smiled faintly, as if he had been waiting for the question. "We've been over this, Sofia. You needed fixing." "No," she said, turning to face him. "That's why you think you're here. That's the story you tell yourself. But I'm asking about the beginning. Before you ever set foot in this office, out of all the therapists in this city, all the practices, all the doctors, why did you choose me?" Lorenzo finally gave her the courtesy of his full, undivided attention. He leaned forward slightly, the amusement in his eyes replaced by a look of frank assessment. He was going to lay his last card on the table. "Because Dr. Finch didn't refer me to you, Sofia. I had him in my debt, a small matter involving some unfortunate gambling habits. He made the introduction because I told him to." A cold stillness settled over Sofia. Even now, after everything, a small, naive part of her had clung to the idea that some part of their meeting was legitimate, a professional referral gone horribly wrong. "My people are very thorough," Lorenzo continued, his voice a low, matter-of-fact murmur. "They researched every reputable psychologist in a 50-mile radius. I wanted the best, but not just the most acclaimed. I wanted the right one. I had them gather their papers, their public statements, their case studies. I read them all." He paused, letting the weight of his meticulous planning sink in. "And then I found your doctoral thesis, hidden away in a university archive, The Savior Complex in Modern Professional Women, a clinical analysis of compassion as a pathological defense mechanism. It was brilliant, insightful, and deeply, deeply personal. I knew, reading your words, that you weren't just writing about your patients. You were writing about yourself." The revelation was a final, devastating blow. He hadn't just stumbled upon her weakness, he had researched it, studied it, and used her own academic work as a blueprint for her psychological demolition. "I knew your weaknesses before you ever knew my name," he stated, with no hint of pride or malice, simply as a fact. "I chose you, Dr. Cruz, because I knew you were a healer who desperately needed a wound to heal. I knew you wouldn't be able to resist the challenge, the ultimate reclamation project, the ultimate broken man." The truth, in its full, monstrous scope, hung in the air between them. He hadn't stumbled into her office, he had targeted her. He hadn't been a patient seeking help, he had been a predator on a hunt, and she had been the carefully selected prey. The entire therapeutic relationship, from the very first handshake, had been a lie, a meticulously crafted stage for his game. Lorenzo stood up and walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. The atmosphere in the room was charged, electric. The money is yours, Sophia. The choice is yours. You can run, disappear, try to report me, though we both know how that will end. My people would find you before you finished filing the paperwork. Your life would become a series of cheap motels and looking over your shoulder, and that is no life at all. He took another step closer. His voice was low, persuasive, almost hypnotic. Or you can accept what you are. A brilliant, powerful woman who has been living her life at 10% capacity, pouring all her energy into propping up the weak and unworthy. I am offering you the chance to live at 100%, to cut the dead weight, starting with men like Mark and a brother who uses you as a bank, to embrace your own strength, your own desires. He looked at her, his eyes burning with a fierce proprietary intensity. I'm not asking you to be mine, Sophia. I'm not asking you to join my world. I'm asking you to be yours, to build your own world, on your own terms. This was his ultimate move. It was a temptation far greater than money. He wasn't trying to possess her. He was trying to remake her in his own image of strength. He was offering her not just freedom from her burdens, but freedom from her own nature. It was the most twisted, diabolical, and yet most profound form of therapy imaginable. He wasn't trying to break her. He was trying to unleash her. Sophia was silent for a long time, the roaring in her head finally quieting to a focused hum. Her gaze drifted to the desk, to the framed photo of her and her father. She saw his kind, tired eyes, the gentle smile of a man who gave everything of himself and died with nothing to show for it but the love of a daughter who had inherited his destructive need to save others. She thought of her own life, a quiet series of sacrifices, a long, slow martyrdom on the altar of other people's needs. Then she looked at Lorenzo, a man who took everything he wanted, a man who owned the world because he was not afraid to claim it. She saw the two extremes, the giver and the taker, the saint and the sinner. And in the space between them, she realized there had to be a third path. Her path. She turned her back on the photo of her father, a symbolic act that felt both like a betrayal and a liberation. She faced Lorenzo, her spine straight, her chin high. The terrified woman who had rehearsed her termination speech in the mirror was gone forever. In her place was someone new, someone forged in the fire of his terrifying attention. I will accept the investment, she said, her voice clear and steady, resonating with an authority that surprised even her. A slow smile of triumph touched Lorenzo's lips, but it vanished as she continued. But not as a gift, she stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. It is a loan. I will sign a contract, and I will pay it back with interest over the next 20 years. I will use it to open a new practice, a real one, built on my own terms. She took a breath, holding his gaze, the power in the room now flowing from her. And I will continue to be your therapist. She paused, letting the words settle, watching the flicker of surprise in his eyes. But we will have new terms. Our sessions will no longer be a game, a performance. They will be a true exchange. You will not interfere in my personal life. You will not fix my problems. My life is my own to manage or mismanage as I see fit. And in this room, you will answer my questions. All of them. Honestly. No more allegories, no more deflections. You will give me the truth of your world, and I will give you the tools to understand your place in it. She took a final step toward him, closing the distance, her eyes level with his. Those are my terms, a real therapeutic alliance, or we are done. The choice is yours, Lorenzo. 6 months later, the scent of old books and quiet desperation was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp fragrance of new leather and ambition. Sophia's new office was on the 34th floor of a gleaming glass and steel tower that pierced the heart of the city's financial district. It was 3 times the size of her old space, a minimalist masterpiece of charcoal gray, polished chrome, and dark, rich wood. A single massive window made up the entire back wall, offering an expansive, godlike view of the city sprawling below. The space did not whisper of comfort and safety. It radiated quiet, absolute power. Sophia sat not behind a desk, but in a sleek black leather armchair, one of a pair that faced the window, the city itself serving as the backdrop for her sessions. She was dressed in a sharp, elegant sheath dress the color of slate, her hair pulled back in a severe, stylish knot. The soft, approachable woman from the beginning of the story was a ghost, a memory. This woman was all clean lines and sharp angles, her posture perfect, her expression serene and unreadable. The door to the office opened with a quiet click, and Lorenzo walked in. He stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes sweeping across the new space. He took in the clean lines of the furniture, the expensive art on the walls, the breathtaking view. Then his gaze settled on Sofia. He saw the new dress, the new hair, the new, unshakable confidence in her eyes. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his features, quickly followed by a slow smile. It was not the predatory curve of his lips she had once feared, nor the triumphant smirk of a manipulator. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated respect. He had set out to fix her, to mold her into his image of strength. But she had done something far more interesting. She had become her own. Without a word, he walked past the chair she had designated for him and moved to the other one, the one that had always been the patient's chair in her old office. He sat down, the expensive fabric of his suit sighing against the leather. He was no longer the king visiting a subject. He was a client, arriving for his appointment. Sofia watched him, a faint knowing smile touching her own lips. The power dynamic was now, finally, perfectly balanced. The game was over. The therapy, the real therapy, was about to begin. "Good afternoon, Lorenzo," she said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "Shall we begin?"